Hi everyone. Today we are going to discuss a recent Supreme Court judgment regarding GST exemption on renting of residential dwelling to residential dwelling for residential purpose. So the parties were the appellant were the Karnataka state government and the respondent was Taghar Vasudev Ambarish. Taghar Vasudev Ambarish and others are the respondent. Now before going into the detailed discussion about the case, I just quickly try to give you a background about this case. Now, this case, the petitioner were the one second. In this case, the petitioner were the state of Karnataka and the respondent was Taghar Vasudev Ambarish. Now, I'm trying to give a background because a lot happened before the AAR advanced ruling, authority for advanced ruling, and AAR and High Court, and how it came to Supreme Court and what was the transaction. Just that I am trying to give you a quick outview. Now this Taghar Vasudev Ambarish respondent is a co-owner of a residential property which is like a 4-storied building with 42 rooms, and this residential property they have leased to Mrs. D12 Spaces Private Limited. So thereby the co-owner or the owners of the property are the lessors. We have referred them as lessor, and this D12 Spaces Private Limited were lessee. And what this D12 Spaces Private Limited lessee is doing was they were in turn subleasing it to students and working women. Now their period of stay ranges between 3 months to 12 months. Now this is what the transaction that is happening. Now if you observe, there are two transactions involved in this, that is transaction 1 and transaction 2. Now transaction 1 was between the owners of the property and the lessee, that is D12 Spaces Private Limited, and the other one was D12 giving sublease to students and working women. So this is what the transaction. Now if you observe, there was one exemption entry in GST, that service by way of renting of what? Renting of residential dwelling for residential purpose. Residential purpose. There are three elements involved here. One is renting should be there. Renting of what? There should be a service called a renting, and that renting of property called a residential dwelling. You should rent residential dwelling, and that residential dwelling should be used for residential purpose. These are the three conditions involved in that exemption entry. Now if you look here, the whatever the first third building with 42 rooms is there now, whether it is a residential dwelling or not, it was the first doubt to the owners. And the other doubt that they have, doubt or ambiguity, or I just want to say that they want to be double sure that there should not be any litigation. I am trying to give you the reason why they have went for advanced ruling, or what was the gray area involved in this interpreting this exemption entry. Now, maybe one reason was whether this 42 rooms is a 42 rooms 4-story building, whether it is a residential dwelling or not. And the other one was here, what transaction we are analyzing for this exemption was the transaction 1, not the transaction 2. In this entire judgment, we are going to analyze whether this transaction 1 is exempted or not. Now, in this transaction 1, if you observe, the recipient is nowhere using it for residential purpose. Recipient in turn subleasing. Now that subleasing is for residential staying purpose, staying of students and working women and all. Whether this comes as a usage for residential purpose, or whether it will be a commercial usage and not for residential purpose. Now this is the ambiguity involved. So for this reason, the owners of the building, like this Taghar Vasudev Ambarish, they have taken an advance ruling. In that advance ruling, they have said that as the recipient in this case, that is a D12 Spaces Private Limited, as the recipient is not directly using it for residential purpose, you are not eligible for the exemption, is what the advance ruling had said. So agreed by this, they have appealed that advance ruling with the appellate authority, AAR, they have approached. They are also more or less same thing they got. Agreed by this order also, they have approached the Honorable Karnataka High Court. Now the Karnataka High Court had said that nowhere from the exemption entry it is clearly coming that only the recipient should have to use it for residential purpose. It is not clearly coming from the exemption entry. Thereby the owners, that is lessees, are eligible for the exemption, is what the Karnataka High Court had said. Now agreed by the Karnataka High Court judgment, the revenue had approached the Honorable Supreme Court. So this is what the background of the case, and I hope the background was clear. Okay, now let us discuss the analysis of the Supreme Court. Now 1 second. Supreme Court analysis, if you have observed, at very first they have started analyzing what is a residential dwelling. What is a residential dwelling? Now, while analyzing what is a residential dwelling, so this residential dwelling is not defined under the GST law. Thereby, they have referred the CBIC education guide. In CBIC education guide, it was said that residential dwelling is any residential accommodation but does not include hotel, motel, inn, guest house or like places meant for temporary stay. So residential dwelling means any residential accommodation is what they have said. Now not only this, they have referred on another Bombay High Court judgment, that is Bandhu Raviji Nikam. 1 second, sorry. Yeah, so they have also referred the Bandhu Raviji Nikam, High Court of Bombay judgment, in which the residential dwelling has been detailedly discussed. Okay, so now if you observe this judgment, what they have said was, undoubtedly hostel is nothing but a house of residence or lodging for students. Just because the respondent may charge some amount from the students for providing that facility may not necessarily mean that it is commercial or non-residential user. So they are saying that undoubtedly hostel is nothing but house of residence or lodging for students. Just because they are charging some money, the hostel owner or the management is charging some money, you can't say that it is a commercial or non-residential user, as they are using it for residence. It can be a residential accommodation is what they have said. And also they have said that this court has held that the word resident may receive a liberal meaning. For a man's resident is very often the place where he sleeps at night. That is one point they have observed. And also they have said that residence only connotes that a person eats, drinks and sleep at that place, and that is not necessary that he should own it. And also they have said that students' hostel was also to be used for sleeping, eating, studies, etc. temporarily but not permanently. Thereby, as they are using it for temporarily, you cannot say that it is a it cannot be described as non-residential. It should be described as a residential. So simply speaking, the crux of this case was, what it was saying was, a residential dwelling or whenever I want to refer anything as a resident, it is a place where a person can eat, sleep, drink and stay. That will be called as a residence. Okay. Now they have also referred the definition of dwelling and residence as per the Oxford Dictionary and Blacklaw Dictionary. So residence, place where one actually lives or has his home, that is called residence, is what the Blacklaw Dictionary had referred. And dwelling is house or other structure in which a person or a persons live, a residence, abode, habitation, etc. Now here what was the crux was, further in common parlance, residential dwelling means any building, structure or part of the building intended to be used as home or residence. So if you ask me to by combining all this observation, simply what I can say was, residential dwelling is house or structure which where a person eats, drinks and sleep. That place can be called as a residential dwelling. By looking at all this discussion, what we can say was, an hostel can be called as a residential dwelling because an hostel is also a part of a structure or a building where people generally eat, sleep and drink or staying purpose they are using there. That will be the residence. Okay, so simply we can say that an hostel as an residential dwelling only. Okay, thus any residential accommodation meant for long term stay can be referred as residential dwelling. In view of the aforesaid, we have no hesitation in reaching the conclusion that the subject property is a residential dwelling. By considering all this discussion, what the Supreme Court is saying, that they don't have any hesitation in accepting it as a residential dwelling. They are accepting it as a residential dwelling. Okay. Now the only question now left to address is whether the third condition to be eligible for exemption, that is, such a residential dwelling must be given for use as a residence. Whether that has been being used as a resident by the recipient, or whether it should have to be definitely used by the recipient, or any person can also use it. That is what the question. Okay. Now what they are saying was, here before going to the further discussion, I just want to highlight one point which the revenue had highlighted was, or the major contention of the revenue right from the beginning was, here in this transaction, the supplier was the owner, the recipient is D12. Now what they are trying to highlight was D12 being the recipient is not directly using it for residential purpose. They are doing a sublease. Thereby this transaction 1 is not eligible for exemption, is what the argument of the revenue right from the beginning. Now if you look here, what the court had said was, court had exactly countered that point. We are not impressed by the submission canvassed on behalf of the revenue, okay, that since lessee did not use the hostel as a resident but rather subleased the same to students or working women, such a transaction does not fall within entry 13. Okay, they are not impressed by that submission, is what they have said. And it is observed that entry 13 of the exemption notification does not mandate that the lessee must use the residential dwelling as its own residence. See, if you observe this exemption entry, they have said that it should be used for residential purpose. They didn't say that only recipient should have to use. Their intention was, what point we can catch here was, ultimately it should be used for residential purpose. Whether recipient using or whether third person is using there is no any importance for that matter in this exemption entry, is what we can understand based on the discussion that happened till now. So rightly Supreme Court is also highlighting the same point. Now what they are saying was, if you are giving any other interpretation to the entry 13, what can happen was, 18% GST is levied on this transaction. If, say for example, here between transaction 1, if 18% GST is levied, ultimately it would be burden on the students and the working women who are ultimately using it for residential purpose. So that's what they have said, that the same would ultimately be passed on to the students and working professionals, which would lead to a situation where the legislative intent being granting exemption for residential use is defeated. Why they brought this exemption? Whenever you are using a property, residential dwelling for residential usage, there should not be any tax. Now, if I start taxing the transaction 1, what the D12 spaces will do? The D12 spaces will shift the burden of tax to the students and the working women who are staying. No, what is the object or what is the intention of the exemption entry? The intention of the exemption entry was they don't want to put a tax burden on people who are using a residential dwelling for residential purpose. No, the students and women are using them for residential purpose only. No, even though using the tax burden is being kept on them, because D12 spaces, they will shift the tax burden on them if it was taxed. Thereby, if you are interpreting in such a way, if you are doing any narrow interpretation, it is ultimately defeating the legislative intent, is what the Supreme Court had said. Okay. Now they have also referred an another important judgment called Mother Superior. Okay, it was a judgment called State of Kerala versus Mother Superior Adoration Convent, a very, very important judgment. Now, before going into Mother Superior, I just want to highlight another judgment, that is Commissioner of Customs versus Dilip Kumar and Company, a very, very important judgment which generally people will refer whenever there is any interpretation issues which regarding to the taxing statutes. Now, in this judgment, what they have said was, exemption notification should be interpreted strictly. Okay, when there is ambiguity in exemption notification, the benefit of such ambiguity cannot be claimed by the subject or assessee and must be interpreted in favor of the revenue. So what they are trying to say was, whenever you are interpreting any exemption entry, if any ambiguity is there, that ambiguity ka benefit should be given to the revenue but not to the assessee, is what Dilip Kumar had said. In the case of Commissioner of Customs versus Dilip Kumar and Company. So in our scenario, in this exemption entry, what is the ambiguity? The ambiguity is that whether recipient should have to use it for residential purpose or anyone can use it. This is the ambiguity. No, this ambiguity was not, this was the ambiguity in the exemption entry. Now, if I apply Dilip Kumar, what I can say? In this ambiguity, I have to give benefit to the revenue. Benefit to the revenue means, what I should say? I should say that this is taxable. Like if recipient, when any ambiguity, I have to give benefit to the revenue means if I apply the same thing to the current case, the ambiguity is that recipient is not using. As recipient is not using, they can say that this is not exempted. So this is what the final outcome can be if I start applying the Dilip Kumar case. This is the background story of Dilip Kumar case, and there was a small contradiction which was there in the Mother Superior. I won't say contradiction, much clarity was given in Mother Superior. Now before in this background, now let us understand the Mother Superior case, what they have said in the Mother Superior case. Now in Mother Superior case, what they have said was, it may be noticed that the 5-judge bench judgment, that is Dilip Kumar case, they are commenting about Dilip Kumar case, did not refer to the line of authority which made a distinction between exemption provisions generally and exemption provisions which have a beneficial purpose. Now what they are doing here, what they are saying here was, in Mother Superior Adoration Convent case, what they are saying was, exemption notification, there are two categories. One is exemption notification in general and another is exemption provisions which have a beneficial purpose. This classification Dilip Kumar case has missed is what they have highlighted first. Next one. This being the case, a literal formalistic interpretation of the statute at hand is to be eschewed. Eschewed means avoided. Now what they are trying was, this being the stand. This being the stand means, sorry, I missed this point. Beneficial purpose of the exemption. Now whenever you are interpreting any exemption provisions which have a beneficial purpose, okay na? Now going literal formalistic interpretation should be avoided. So whenever you are interpreting any exemption provisions having beneficial purpose, going with a literal interpretation should be avoided, eschewed. We must first ask ourselves, what is the object sought to be achieved by the provision? What is the object? And construe the statute in accordance with such object. So, no, Dilip Kumar case had said that exemption entry, whenever there is any ambiguity, you should have to give benefit to the revenue, is what Dilip Kumar case had said. Now, what this case, in Mother Superior, what they have said was, exemption entries, you have missed. Dilip Kumar case has missed the classification. Exemption entries with, beneficial purpose should have to be constructed by looking at the object and by looking at the intention of the legislature. So you have missed that fact, is what the Mother Superior judgment had highlighted. Not only this, they have also referred another beautiful judgment called Union of India versus Wood Papers Limited. So what they have said was, truly speaking, liberal and strict construction of an exemption provisions are to be invoked at different stages of interpreting. So this is going to be an ultimate point, a very, very important point. So you can appreciate the Supreme Court judgment only if you understood this point. When the question is whether a subject falls in the notification or in the exemption clause, then it being in nature of exception is to be construed strictly and against the subject, but once ambiguity or doubt about applicability is lifted, then the subject falls in the notification, then full play should be given to it and it calls for a wider and liberal construction. What they are trying to say was, whether you will fall in that exemption notification or not, or every exemption notification will give some conditions. Whether you are meeting that conditions or not, you should do strict interpretation. Now, once you are meeting that criteria, even then there is any ambiguity, then you have to interpret it liberally, is what it is saying. Okay, this was said by what? Wood Papers Limited case. Now I will apply this to this judgment ka crux, I will try to apply in our current case. Okay. Now in our current case, what are the conditions that I should be satisfied to get exemption? One is there should be a supply of service of renting. Supply of renting services should be there. Yes, it is there. Next one, renting should be a residential dwelling. Yes, court had said that it was a residential dwelling and it should be used for residential purpose. Yes, it is being used for residential purpose. I am satisfying these three conditions. Three conditions I am satisfying. Whether I am satisfying these three conditions or not, interpretation should be strictly. Now, what is the ambiguity? They said that it should be used for residential purpose, but they didn't say that who should use, whether ultimately should be used or whether the recipient should have to use. That is ambiguity part. Now, by applying the Wood Papers Limited case, these three conditions I will interpret strictly. I am satisfying it also. Now, what is the ambiguity? The ambiguity here was whether who should use. Ambiguity was who should use. Whether recipient or ultimate. Now here I have to give what? Liberal interpretation. Now liberal interpretation, by interpreting I can say that ultimately it is being used for residential purpose na. Thereby they would get exemption is what I can say by applying the wood paper. Now 2 points here we have to understand was, one is applying mother superior. Now as per mother superior, this exemption entry is an exemption entry with beneficial purpose. Now beneficial purpose, you have to do liberal interpretation is 1 point I got from mother superior. And also by applying wood papers case, what I can say was, these 3 conditions, whether I am not satisfying or not, I have done a strict interpretation, fine, I have satisfying. After that there is an ambiguity, that ambiguity I can take liberal interpretation. This is what a settled principle in wood papers case. Clear? So this is what the Supreme Court had said, and now by applying all these things, by this time we would have get clarity that recipient only should use it for residential purpose is not mandatory to get the exemption. Let us look at what further the court had said. Now they have started this purposive interpretation in law. Now generally whenever there is any ambiguity, whenever there is no ambiguity and the words are clear, generally we will do a literal interpretation. Whenever 1 or 2 interpretations can be possible, then generally we will go with purposive interpretation. So that is a known principle, that's what they have highlighted. Though literal rule of interpretation till sometimes ago was treated as the golden rule, it is now the doctrine of purposive interpretation which is predominant, where literal interpretation may not serve the purpose. So always you have to do literal interpretation only, but if that is not serving your purpose, then you have to go with purposive interpretation is what they have said. Now they have also said that the legislative intention behind this exemption clause is that a rented property used as a residence should not suffer 18% GST or IGST. However, if entry is given such narrow interpretation, then exemption will not be available. So even if I take the intention of the legislature was you should use it for residence. If ultimately you should use it for residential purpose. If you are using for residential purpose, I am happy, I will give you exemption. That is what my ultimate purpose. The moment you are satisfying, you are eligible for exemption. This is what I can say. If GST is levied on this, the same will be passed on to the student. This already we have discussed it, that then the legislative intent behind granting exemption would be defeated. So in addition to the above, under entry 13, again an important point came. Activity specific exemption is not person specific exemption. Now what they are saying was, they are again classifying exemption as activity specific exemption and person specific exemption. They are saying that whatever the entry we are analyzing is an activity specific exemption, it is not a purpose specific exemption. Now what is a person specific exemption and activity specific exemption? Here they didn't mention anything that I will give exemption only if you are providing it to a person. They are saying that residential dwelling using for residential purpose is enough for me, they have said. They didn't say that it should be used by government or it should be used by a charitable trust. Like that, they didn't give any person specific exemption. Okay, now person specific exemption I can give, like example, in GST itself, hiring of motor vehicle having seating capacity more than 13, okay, to a state transport undertaking, then it is exempted, or to a GTA, then it is exempted. Now if I am providing to STU, then only it will be exempted. If I am providing to GTA, then only it is exempted. These all are examples for person specific exemption. This is not a person specific exemption, this is an activity specific exemption is what they have violated. Now what they are trying to say is, now what is the argument of the revenue? The argument of the revenue was recipient only should have to use. Now what they are trying to say is, if the intention of the legislature was that recipient only should have to use, they would have given a person specific exemption rather than an activity based exemption is what the court want to highlight. So this is an activity based exemption, thereby your argument I cannot accept is what court had said. They have given an examples for the activity specific exemption, that is services by a charitable trust by way of charitable activities, transmission or distribution of electricity. All these points they have given as an examples. Now they have highlighted the exemption, the amendment which were done on 18th July 2022. So that amendment was for use as resident except where the residential dwelling is rented as a registered person. Now what they are trying to was, even though this exemption is there, that exemption will become only till 18th July 2022, because after 18th July 2022 it is taxable in this scenario, because it is being taken by the registered person, that is the D12 is a registered person, thereby it will be taxable is what they are trying to highlight. Now they are saying that there is also another explanation which they have said that No, whenever a registered person, that is proprietor of a proprietorship function, takes a residential dwelling for his personal purpose, then it is exempted, is what they have said. So by this explanation also they are trying to give clarity. That explanation clearly shows that even if the rent is paid by a registered person, the exemption will be available if it is used for the purpose of own residence and is rented in the personal capacity. Therefore, the intention from the beginning was to ensure that rental agreements for use of the property for residential purpose are granted exemption. See, that is what they have given. This explanation is what they are trying to say. Their intention right from the beginning was to give exemption whenever they are using it for residential purpose. That is the reason why that benefit, that explanation they have inserted and said that even though being taken by a registered person, if that registered person is using for his personal home and all or personal residence and all, it is exempted, is what they are trying to say. So in view of the aforesaid decision, we have reached the conclusion that we should interfere with the impugned judgment and order passed by the High Court. As a result, both the appeal fails and hereby dismissed. They have dismissed the appeal and they have upheld the judgment given by the Karnataka High Court. Now, final last crux which I want to give was, whenever you are interpreting the exemption entry, actually here taxing statutes, generally people will say that taxing statute should be done a strict interpretation. No, after reading Dilip Kumar and Mother Superior, what I can say was, in my humble opinion, what I can say was, whenever you are interpreting taxing statutes, whether you are interpreting charging section or exemption, whether you are interpreting charging section or whether you are interpreting exemption notification or exemption entry. If you are in both the scenarios, first you have to do literal interpretation only. That is strict construction only you have to do, both the scenarios. But in charging section, if there is any benefit of doubt, if there is any ambiguity or if there is any benefit, that benefit should be given to the assessee. Benefit should be given to the assessee whenever you are interpreting the charging section. Why? Because there was an article called Article 245. Now, any taxing statutes is deriving their power from Article 245 only. Now, without proper authority of law, no person can be taxed. Now, in charging section, if there is any ambiguity, like it is not clearly coming whether my income is taxable or not, or whether my service is taxable or not, it is not clearly coming from the charging section. There is an ambiguity. That ambiguity ka benefit should be given to me. Why? Because Article 245 conflict can come. Because Article 245 is saying that you cannot collect the tax without proper authority of the law. So that is the reason why in charging section, you have to do strict interpretation, but ambiguity benefit should be given to the assessee. But exemption entry, also you have to do strict interpretation, but what they have said was, any ambiguity is there, now that ambiguity ka benefit should be given to the subject matter, that is to the assessee if it is a exemption notification for beneficial purpose. Now, why this classification they have done was exemption notification for beneficial purpose. Now, government sometimes to encourage, to give incentives, they will give some exemptions. Like they want to encourage education, they will give exemption to the education. No, education exemption is a beneficial exemption. It is not a general exemption. No, health sector exemption, that is also a beneficial exemption. No, government intention was that service should have to be completely exempted. Just because there is an ambiguity and if you are decided to do a strict interpretation and if you are taxing an health service or taxing an education, it is ultimately defeating the purpose. That is how the structure was framed like this. The interpretation was developed like this. No, government incentives related, government benefit related, or always through taxing statutes. No, if you refer section 11 also, they will say that in public interest to do so. Government sometimes will want to give some benefits, want to give some relaxations to the public. So in that context, they will issue exemption notification with the beneficial purpose. There you should always keep in your mind the intention of the legislature whenever you are interpreting in case of any ambiguity. Right? So this is all from my side. I hope it is clear. If you really like this video, please like, share, comment and share this with your friends and other professionals. Thank you.